Dave, thank you so much, and well, what a privilege it is to be here, and I hope you all know how lucky you are to have Colonel Dave Gray here on your team. So I had the opportunity in 2003 to visit pretty much every unit in Iraq multiple times, and I could say by far his battalion was the most effective unit in combat of all those that I saw over the course of that year. He was right in the heart of this growing insurgency. But based on the toughness, the discipline, the tremendous performance of him and his soldiers, it was the area that was probably the best secure, even though it was in the most difficult place. So, Dave, it's just great to see you here. Wow, what a great conference with some of the star-studded conference with Ambassador Litt here today. Great to see you again, and to see so many old friends, Pete Mansour, Dave Kilcullen, General Jumper. Great to see you here, sir. But General P, thank you for the tremendous opportunity to be with you and this great institution. General Caslin, faculty and staff of VMI, and especially, though, cadets and students who are here today. Thank you again for the privilege of participating in this important conference and giving me the opportunity to visit this great institution. Even though this is my first visit to the Virginia Military Institute, I am in debt to VMI, as are all of us in our armed forces, for developing leaders who've inspired us through their example of courageous and selfless service. General George Marshall, foremost among them. Many members of the VMI family have had a profound and personal influence on me over the years. These include your superintendent, General P., your former dean, General Casey Brower, a true soldier scholar, your current dean, Brigadier General Jeffrey Smith, Major General Cedric Wins, who I had the great privilege of serving with. He's class of 1985. And then also Mr. Ed Mazzani, who I worked with for the class of 1972. And my executive officer, Neil, stand up there for a minute. VMI graduate from the class of 1992. So VMI graduates have been all around me my whole career and have inspired me, and in the case of Neil, compensated for my many deficiencies. So it is great to be with you. So I want to begin, though, by thanking the cadets here today and the ROTC students for volunteering to serve our nation in time of war. Those of you who are entering the military profession are doing so at a critical time for our nation and for all humanity. You will face many difficulties that involve physical hardship, separation from family, and the loss of comrades in battle. But there will be tremendous rewards for your service, often less tangible rewards, including being part of endeavors larger than yourself, leading teams committed to excellence and committed to each other, being part of organizations that take on the quality of a family, families in which the man or woman next to you is willing to give everything, including their own lives for you. I'm excited for you, and I'm privileged to be with you. Today is a time identified in the title of this conference of global transition. And as you've heard yesterday and today, that transition involves increasing danger to national security and international security. We are engaged today, as General George C. Marshall's generation was engaged, against enemies who pose a great threat to all civilized peoples. As our World War II generation defeated Nazi fascism and Japanese imperialism, and as later generations defeated communist totalitarianism, we will defeat today's enemies, including terrorist organizations like Daesh, who cynically use a perverted interpretation of religion to incite hatred and justify horrific cruelty against innocents. In retrospect, this transition from what we called the post-Cold War period in the 1990s to this time of increasing danger began with the murder of more than 3,000 innocents on September 11th, 2001. Protecting our nation and the way of life, our way of life, between now and 2040, when one of our cadets here today may be delivering this speech, will demand wise and principled military and civilian leadership. Among the young men and women here today may be the next Marshal. But the problems he or she faces, like the problems of General Marshall's time, will be too big for any one man or woman. So we all might aspire to be more like General Marshall, to study history and strategy, to understand the nature of competitions with enemies and adversaries, and to recognize that we also must know ourselves and maintain the will necessary to prevail and preserve our way of life. Despite recent battlefield successes in Iraq, the terrorist threat is not going away anytime soon. It could get worse. We and our European allies know from recent experiences that battlegrounds overseas are inexorably connected to our own security. The ongoing humanitarian and political catastrophe in the greater Middle East has already generated a multi-generational security problem. Ultimately, we know that if these terrorists and murderers were to gain access to weapons of mass destruction, attacks such as those on September 11th and those against innocents since then would pale in comparison. But the threat of terrorism and terrorist organizations is not the only danger that you marshals of the future will confront. We have seen in recent years the return of geopolitics, that combination of geography, relative power among actors, and political competitions. Geopolitics has returned as U.S. rivals from Europe to the greater Middle East to East Asia attempt to collapse the post-World War II political, economic, and security order that General Marshall helped to establish. Geopolitics has returned as hostile revisionist powers, Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran, annex territory, intimidate our allies, develop nuclear weapons, and use proxies under the cover of modernized conventional militaries. Confronting these revisionist powers is challenging. Challenging in part because they employ sophisticated strategies that combine military efforts with propaganda, disinformation, espionage, and political subversion. They often act below the threshold that would elicit a concerted response from us and our allies. So as the sub-theme for yesterday's panel discussion observed, this is a turbulent as well as a dangerous time of transition. And as the panel this morning observed, this turbulent and dangerous time requires strategic vision. A strategic vision to protect our nation, not only from insurgent and terrorist organizations such as the Taliban, Al-Qaeda, and Daesh, but also from antagonistic states such as Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea. That strategic vision requires an appreciation for the unique aspects of each threat and a recognition that these hostile actors do not operate in isolation from one another. They watch and assess American actions and responses across the globe. They calibrate their actions. As today's sub-theme recognizes, what is needed to secure our nation from those who would do us harm and undermine our way of life is an integrated grand strategy to drive the purposeful employment of all instruments of our power: diplomatic, military, informational, economic, intelligence, and law enforcement. But there's a problem there. Strategic vision and grand strategy are areas in which we are deficient. As threats to U.S. and international security are increasing, I believe our strategic competency is diminished. We are even confused about what strategy is. As historian Hugh Strachan has observed, the word strategy has acquired a universality which has robbed it of meaning and left it only with banalities. But this confusion is not only banal, it is dangerous. Loss of precision in the word strategy has encouraged in our nation, I believe, a narcissistic approach to national security, in which we define problems only in relation to us and what we'd like to do. Strategies are frequently based on what the purveyor prefers rather than what the situation demands. Today, incomplete plans, disconnected in large measure from the problems they are ostensibly meant to address, masquerade as strategies and establish a deceptive rationale for folly and strategic failure. So what we might consider three things today. That institutions like this great Virginia Military Institute and you, the cadets and students, might do to regain the strategic competence necessary to protect our nation and all civilized peoples during this period, this period of danger and transition. If we focus on these three things, even if one does not reach the ideal of becoming the next General Marshal, we might all be more like him and be better equipped to protect our nation in the turbulent and dangerous time ahead. So what are these? First, understand what strategy is. Second, acknowledge strategy's interactive or competitive nature. And third, know ourselves as the first step in maintaining our will to execute any strategy. To understand what strategy is, we might consider the simple definition taught across all of our military services. Strategy is the intelligent identification, use, and coordination of resources, or ways and means, for the successful attainment of specific objectives or ends. But strategy extends beyond logic and reason because it also has a moral component. Dr. Richard Betts defines strategy as the essential ingredient for making war either politically effective or morally tenable. It is the link between military means and political ends, the scheme of how to make one produce the other. Without strategy, there is no rationale for how force will achieve purposes worth the price in blood and treasure. In war, strategy must make clear to the American people how the risks to their sons and daughters and the sacrifices those sons and daughters make will achieve an outcome worthy of those risks and worthy of those sacrifices. Second, acknowledging strategy's interactive and competitive nature is foundational to strategy's logical and moral components. Strategy must account for the interactive nature of war and competitions short of war. Strategy must adapt to change because war is interaction between opposing wills that, when combined with violence, chance, and emotion, make the future course of events impossible to predict. As Professor Hugh Strachan observed, one sort of war can turn into another. That ought to sound familiar to us in our experience across the last 15 years. This is what happened in Iraq in 2003, for example. And our strategy did not catch up until 2007. More than 2,000 years ago, Sun Tzu wrote, "If you know the enemy and know yourself, you need not fear the result of 100 battles. If you know yourself, but not the enemy, For every victory gained, you will also suffer a defeat. If you know neither the enemy nor yourself, you will succumb in every battle. I believe that if Sun Tzu and the other great captains of history, from Julius Caesar to Karl von Clausewitz to George Marshall, were to return today and evaluate the strategies of recent wars, they might conclude that we have disregarded completely what they tried to teach us. Instead of really knowing our enemy, most of our citizens do not even know who we're fighting, let alone the stakes of these interactive conflicts today. How many Americans could even name the three main Taliban groups in Afghanistan and Pakistan that we have been fighting since 2001? And rather than recognizing the interactive nature of the wars in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Libya, for example, our strategies were based mainly on how we would prefer to fight. We announced publicly, often years in advance, how we intend to limit our level of effort. In the most extreme form, our neglect of strategy's interactive nature manifests itself in the assumption that a war will end if we disengage from it. And we ignore the effect that public announcements concerning limitations on the nature, scale, or time of our effort have on maintaining our own will to fight, defeating the enemy's will, what Clausewitz described as the need to convince the enemy that the enemy's been defeated, or bolstering the will of our allies and partners. Third, sound strategy depends on knowing ourselves, because knowing ourselves is foundational to generating and sustaining the will and moral strength necessary to prevail. Knowing ourselves has three components: purpose, or knowing what we want; commitment, or knowing what it takes to win; and self-knowledge, or knowing who we are and what we value. First, clear purpose is integral to developing sound strategy and sustaining popular will. Winston Churchill, who understood the meaning of strategy and its interactive nature, observed that there must be an all-embracing view which presents the beginning and the end, the whole and each part, as one instantaneous impression, retentively and untiringly held in the mind. That all-embracing view is critical to knowing what we want to achieve and understanding what it takes to win. In today's wars and competitions, what is our all-embracing view that presents the beginning and the end, the whole and each part? If we cannot answer that question, we are at a severe disadvantage relative to determined enemies and adversaries. But there are some who say, the idea of winning a war, that's passé. They are wrong. As the 19th century Prussian philosopher of war, Karl von Clausewitz, observed, in war, each side tries to outdo the other. If we not try to outdo the enemy, we're unlikely to prevail in any conflict. So because war is a competition involving life and death, and in which the nation's security or vital interests are at stake, establishing an objective other than winning is not only counterproductive, but also irresponsible and wasteful. And under some circumstances, an objective other than willing is unethical. Along with proper authority and just cause, St. Thomas Aquinas' just war theory identifies a just end as an essential test for a just war. Failing to define even that just end, or a lack of commitment to achieve it, fails that test Winning, however, does not require a commitment to unconditional surrender or the lifting of all restrictions on force applied or resources committed. What winning does entail is a rational determination to achieve a sustainable outcome, usually a political outcome, consistent with our vital interests. And then finally, sustaining the will necessary to execute strategy and to win is impossible if a nation and its people do not understand who they are and what they stand for. Our values bind our nation together, and our values connect military professionals to the citizens in whose name we fight. In his book, Tribe, Sebastian Junger expresses concern because, as he sees it, the relative security in the modern West has reduced our societal commitment to each other, the common good, as well as our willingness to make sacrifices in defense of our values. So the future marshal must not only understand strategy and strategy's competitive nature, but also lead to foster in our nation a sense of belonging, loyalty to one another, and common commitment to defend our values. So, how might we develop the next marshal? You might think that we've created a tall order. He or she must understand what strategy is, the interactive nature of strategy, the nature of the enemy, and our own nation. And he or she must inspire in soldiers and citizens a willingness to, if necessary, sacrifice to protect our values. This great institution and our ROTC universities across the nation are ideally positioned to develop future George Marshals by enriching the history curriculum and connecting the study of history to the interdisciplinary study of strategy. The problems we're facing today are not unprecedented. So, for example, what might we study? What might we work on together? First, as I mentioned, history. History to help us think in time and to reason by historical analogy. History to help us understand who we are and what we value. Security studies to better understand geopolitical trends and essential elements of effective strategy. Language, geography, and area studies to understand enemies, adversaries, and especially to develop empathy for and understanding of populations among whom wars are fought. Sociology and political science to understand civil-military relations in our society and to help maintain the connection between our military and those in whose name we fight and serve. Psychology to understand the cognitive pitfalls that can lead to blunders and strategic failure. Philosophy, theology, and law to develop empathy and solidify a commitment to moral and ethical conduct in war, consistent with our values. Leadership to understand how to develop and execute strategies, and importantly, to provide the purpose, direction, and motivation necessary to maintain military morale and popular will in war. So the study of military history and the interdisciplinary study of war and strategy is essential to ensuring that the hard-won lessons learned from our most recent conflicts, from the insights of the panelists you've seen here today, do not, in the words of historian Carl Becker, lay inert in unread books. For those in some of our universities who might confuse the study of war and strategy with militarism, you might remind them that thinking clearly about the problem of war and strategy in war is both an unfortunate necessity and the best way to prevent war. As the English theologian, writer, and philosopher G.K. Chesterton observed, war is not the best way of settling differences, but it is the only way of preventing them being settled for you. So the cadets and faculty here, as demonstrated by the content of this excellent conference, are already on the path to developing the next Marshall, are already on the path of regaining our strategic competence. Thank you for the opportunity to be with you. I look forward to hearing where you'd like to take the discussion. Thank you. And for those of you, who watched the game last night, thanks for staying alert. It looks like nobody looked like they were dozing or anything.
General, I'm Colonel Coggins, a professor in naval science here. Nice to have you here. Question on Marshall. Marshall. If Marshall was alive today in this context, with these problems, with this United States, with this current United States values, could he solve the problems like he could in time ago? Is the problems like a yo-yo gonna just come in and out like a fad, Is it like mosquitoes, just persistent, always just whack them, but they're kind of always there? Or is this problem with ISIS more like Nazism? Something has to be done about that.
Yeah. Well, I think something has to be done about it. And so I mentioned that it's also already a multi-generational problem. So what has been different about Daesh or ISIL from other threats is the ability to control population, territories, and resources. And then also to create this illusion of success in their endeavor to fulfill their motto, which is also their mission, endure and expand. Now, the land offensive, obviously, in Iraq, the Turkish offensive in Syria, are really denying the enemy a lot of the territory that they had. And the shift has occurred toward their eventual defeat. But our failure to take action earlier, I think, or our decision not to take action earlier, really has had an effect that made worse, that exacerbated the very destructive civil war in Syria, a country in which 500,000 people, for some estimates, have been killed, and over half, or maybe really 2/3 of the population is dead, wounded, or displaced. So what this represents, I think, is a multi-generational threat that is orders of magnitude greater than the threat from the Afghan alumni, from the Mujahideen resistance to Soviet occupation in Afghanistan, and the growth and strengthening of these groups during the Afghan Civil War from 92 to 96. Remember, those were the people, essentially. You can trace the roots back to September 11th to those Afghan alumni. This is a problem that is orders of magnitude greater. It is a problem that, based on now modern communications, is not confined there. These are people who can recruit, obviously, out of Western societies, who can radicalize, young people who feel disenfranchised or confused about their identity and so forth. And so this is a very grave threat. And so I think if you look at the conflict, it was ultimately hinged on the control of territory, populations, and resources. And so the approach that we took proved to be insufficient in terms of being able to resolve this in a timely manner, because we narrowly circumscribed our effort and instead relied mainly on standoff capabilities and the use of proxies. The limitations of that is that the enemy resisted, or tried to evade being classified as a target. And even though our air power had tremendous effect on this enemy, combined with our intelligence collection and analysis capabilities, that only went so far, obviously, against an enemy that intermingled with civilian population, employed traditional countermeasures of dispersion, concealment, intermingling with those civilian populations. And then, of course, working through proxies, we oftentimes tend to assume, that those who we want to fight for share our interests, right? Well, they don't. Our interests oftentimes are incongruent with those who we would like to do the fighting for us. And so what was missing was a land force, right? A capable land force that had the capability and the will, both, to force an outcome consistent with our interests. But this is a tendency of our strategic thinking and some parts of our military to, in times of peace or times in between wars, to assume that really the next war will be fundamentally different from all those that have gone before it. And this is, the orthodoxy, the revolution of military affairs in the 90s, right? Really, in the next war, we'll have simple, cheap, efficient war that can win that war from standoff range. Or they can win that war by getting others to fight for us, or all these simple solutions to the complex problem of future war. So I think what we need to do to address this deficiency is a recognition of capabilities and limitations of each type of military force, and recognize that American military power is joint power, to recognize that actually all of the conflicts in the world today are about the control of territory, populations, and resources. And we ought to maybe recognize that Daesh initially didn't even have a Navy or an Air Force, and they did okay, right, for a while. So those who want to write off ground combat, I think, are creating vulnerability in our national defense. Now, I don't think our Air Force and Navy get enough credit for what they do, right? I mean, our Air Force has driven the identifiable fielded forces of our enemies off the open battlefield, right? I mean, it is what we're doing in Iraq is only possible. What the Iraqis are doing in Iraq is only possible due to the professionalism and capability of our Air Force. But what we do have to recognize is that military power is joint power. It's rock, paper, scissors, right? So if you have a rock, air power, right? The enemy has paper, dispersion, concealment, intermingling, population, deception, expansion onto other battlegrounds of perception, political subversion, and so forth. Your scissors are land forces, right? But if you don't have the scissors, you got a problem.
Sir, Cadet Wiswall, VMI, thank you very much for coming to speak to us today. I know we all really appreciate it. Are there any specific topics or areas in military history that you would recommend studying to better understand our current international situation or probable future conflicts?
Right. Well, it's a great question. Okay, so I do believe geopolitically that this period of time is analogous to 1914, and I'm not the one who came up with that, but I mean there have been a number of essays about it. The one that I think is most compelling and concise is Margaret Macmillan's essay on the Brookings website called The Rime of History. I think that's a good place to start. I think if you want to make the bridge into the threats by these revisionist states, there's a great book called The Unquiet Frontier by Jakob Griegel and Wes Mitchell that really looks at this, what they describe as a strategic behavior of probing at the far reaches of American power to collapse that post-World War II, post-Cold War political security and economic order and replace that order with orders that are more sympathetic to revisionist power, principally Russia and China, but others' interests as well. So I think those are good places to start. I think in terms of thinking clearly about the problem of future war, there's a great book by Christopher Coker, who seems to write a book every 6 months. I don't know how he does it, man, but it's called The Future of War, appropriately enough. And I think that's also a good short book on that frames really the kind of key considerations that might drive the character of future armed conflict, which I think are really 4 things, right, to consider. So you might even organize your kind of reading around these 4 things. One is threats, enemies, and adversaries in the future operating environment, and you can look at obviously books that really cover some of these specific threats and so forth. The book Putinism is good on Russia, I think, for example, and there are books that really cover the Iran's proxy war against us, which they've been waging since 1979, and what they think the next evolution of that might be. Victor Cha's book, which is a little bit dated now, but there's some new ones too on North Korea. It's called The Impossible State, is very good, I think, on North Korea. And I think, by the way, it's almost impossible to overstate the threat from a nuclear-armed North Korea. So I think reading about the threats, enemies, and adversaries, then reading about missions, right? What kind of missions do we maybe anticipate that we would have to conduct in the future? And I think that reading the service documents, all of which have very strong documents. The Air Force has a really good vision that they've put out recently. The Marine Corps operating concept just came out. The Army, the highly readable Army operating concept, just in time to take to the ski slopes with you and stuff this winter. I mean, it's awesome. It's a page turner, okay? And then also, if to think about all these issues and missions, how it affects the Army, go to the Army Capabilities Integration Center, say that 3 times fast, website, and if you go there, there is a link to our weekly readings, which I can inflict on Colonel Gray to send if you want, but they're archived. And they're short readings about topics related to future war and future force development. The third thing to try to understand is technology, right? And technology's impact on war. The best book, I think, to understand how militaries think about future war and how successful ones innovate and other ones maybe aren't successful, why they're not successful, is a book that was published in 2001, right before September 11th, called The Dynamics of Military Revolution, 1300. This Pete Mansour's and our good friend Williamson Murray. Great to read anything that he's written, obviously. 1300 to 2050 with him and McGregor Knox. And so if you really want to get the Cliff Notes version, or I would say the Guido Sarducci version, but nobody here knows what that is, man, except the older people here. If you want to get the Cliff Notes version of that, what you just read is the last 2 pages, man, or you read the last chapter. But he says, okay, 4 things are critical to thinking clearly about future war. First of all, you have to think about future war based on considering real threats in real geographic areas, real enemies, basically. You can't just have this open-minded, like we did in the 90s, capabilities-based thinking about future war, right? Hey, if the military was an animal, which one do we want to be? It's like free association, right? I mean, okay, it's got to be about real threats, enemies, right? The second thing is to recognize that technology is a catalyst for change, but it's not the principal driver for change. The third thing to recognize is that change is evolutionary. It's not revolutionary, right? And again, that's the interactive nature of war and strategy. I mean, if you try to go for a leap ahead capabilities, hey man, in 2050, I'm going to have this great military that's going to do all this stuff with these narrow range of technological capabilities, well, that gives your enemy years, decades, to figure out how to circumvent that technology, right? And how to make it largely irrelevant to the next war. And then finally, they say that the change has to be based on a very realistic, culture that acknowledges continuities in the nature of wars. War's political nature, war's human nature, war's uncertainty and interactive nature, right? And war's a contest of wills. So there are a number of great books out there, and I'll tell you, if you're looking for a resource, if you go to the Fort Benning webpage and go to the Maneuver Leaders Self-Study Program, what that does, or you can go to the Australian Army's webpage and go to this thing they've just opened called The Cove, and they start with junior officers. So instead of a reading list, that you're like, man, where do I start? What this does is it breaks it down into topics, and based on the topic says, okay, what the topic is, why it's important to maneuver leaders, but it's really all military leaders. It's not just for Army, not just for maneuver leaders. And then how to study that topic. And then it has books, articles, and videos. And so what I would ask you to do is, as you study your profession, as you think about future war, your responsibilities as leaders, form a study group, an informal study group. And it's hard when you're students because you've got enough reading and stuff to do already. But maybe in the summers, maybe on break, pick a book you're going to read together and then discuss. Because it's very important for us to develop as professionals, and a pillar of our profession is professional knowledge, right? Some people sometimes there's this sense, this kind of cynicism you can feel, like it's like uncool, to study your profession, talk about it. But actually, people who say that, they are super arrogant, right? Because what they're saying is, all I need to know to lead soldiers into battle under the most desperate, difficult conditions is my own personal experience. I don't need to learn from the experiences of others, right? Think about how arrogant that is. So I think it's very important to study our profession. Great question. And you can always get my email, any of you, if you ever need any free non-binding advice from an old general. Colonel Gray's got my email, and you can hit me up. There's one down there. Yes.
Sir, Command Sergeant Major Dan Willey, Virginia Tech Corps Cadets. Keeping with the topic for this conference, as well as your background and your current duty, sir, living through the Cold War era and the early operations in Desert Storm and all the great things that we did collectively over there to reduce the threat. In my short 31 years of active duty, I've kind of seen our Army sort of swim like a school of herring. Wherever the threat is, off we go in that direction. Yeah. And you mentioned in your comments there, given the enemy decade or 2 decades coming up to figure out how to make advances and possibly restart the Cold War. In my opinion, the Cold War is going on. It's on. And I've heard a lot of great speakers as we discussed theories and strategies and PhDs and 800-pound brains walk across the stage.
You're talking about P. Mansour, I think.
I'm talking about all of them, sir. They're just great Americans. The thing is, my fear is that we've kind of either just left alone our standing enemies that we know are there, whether it's the Chinese or it's North Korea or it's Iran or it's you name it. These are real bad dudes that can get after it real quick with us. Where's our capabilities to turn that school of herring and get off the rise of the Islamic State, although that's very important, but man, it just scares the hell out of me knowing that I'm going to drift off into the 10 years into retirement and the political situation in our country and watching the Army grow and shrink so many times over those 3 decades. Just a bit alarming, and I wish you would drill down just a bit more there for us, sir.
Okay. So I think what you're talking about is, what should we be prepared for in the future? And one of the things that I think is critical about understanding what future threats are going to be and how you're going to develop your military to deal with those threats is, as Sir Michael Howard has said, no matter how hard you try to do it, no matter how well you set up a clear logical framework to think about future war, you're going to be wrong. I mean, something's going to surprise you. The key is to not be so far off the mark that you can't adjust to those demands of that conflict once they reveal themselves to you. So I think I agree with I think what's behind your question there is we don't have the luxury to pick one threat over the other, right? As a joint force or as an army. So we have to be prepared across the range of military operations. And so there's been kind of a useful term that's come out. Some people don't like it, called hybrid warfare. Pete Mansour wrote a great book about this. And the book really makes the case, and I think the world makes the case, that we're going to have to operate across this range of military operations and against a range of enemies, right? And that's for one fundamental reason, as Conrad Crane has said, who's a very witty, very good scholar, at the Army War College. He said there are 2 ways to fight, right? 2 ways to fight the U.S. military in particular: asymmetrically and stupid, right? So you hope the enemy picks stupid. I mean, in 1991, Saddam Hussein picked stupid. Okay, I mean, it's like calling them out into the schoolyard and beating up on them. So I mean, where they were vulnerable to all of our strengths. Well, everybody watched us very closely since that point, and developed capabilities to try to pull apart what they saw as our greatest strengths, really our air-land capability, our joint capability, especially land forces operating with our amazing Air Force, and so we have to keep thinking about how things are changing. We can't get complacent. So I think that what we have tried to do in our Army is to make that grounded projection into the future and establish a clear framework for thinking about future war, and to do 4 fundamental things in our Army. We have to think clearly about the problem of future war to lay a strong conceptual foundation for Army modernization. We have to learn in a focused, sustained, and collaborative manner over time, which is all of our experimentation, our war games, our seminars. It's intellectual work and it's physical work together. We have to analyze what we've learned so we don't jump to the wrong conclusions and only narrowly focus on one enemy, and help prioritize our efforts. And then we have to implement. We have to get capabilities into the hands of our soldiers and units. So that's what we're focused on, and I don't think we're falling into that trap, Sergeant Major. If we do, you got to let me know. So thank you.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, please give General McMaster a big round of applause.
Thank you.
So I want to thank you for coming today. You've given us a very expansive and very in-depth look at what strategic leadership requires, both now, really, and in the future. And you've given us a lot to think of. I'll take on the task of all those readings and get those out to the cadets. I'd like to, on behalf of the superintendent, the Corps of Cadets, the staff and faculty, please accept this small token of appreciation for coming.
Thanks, brother.
Thanks very much. Another round of applause, please. Thank you for the kind words.